Now, most of you know that Eckhart Tolle played a huge role in my spiritual awakening in 2017. And so it does feel especially satisfying to have the same exact company that published Eckhart's books, The Power of Now and A New Earth, to publish my first book, The Three Beliefs of Ego, which was largely inspired by Mr. Eckhart Tolle himself. And I truly believe that this book is going to play a very similar role in the awakening of humanity that Eckhart's books have played on our planet. I begin this book by sort of describing my awakening journey in the introduction, which was, as many of you know, kind of spontaneously ignited by listening to an Eckhart Tolle lecture on the balcony of my gym at work one day. And, you know, the way that I describe this awakening experience, which many of you have heard me tell on podcasts and interviews, is quite different in the book than I've told it before, because in the book, I spend the most time focusing on the kind of internal process of awakening, all the different shifts in perception that happened in that moment, as well as the kind of painful reverse awakening that I experienced 2 weeks later. All the answers I was looking for were learned during that sort of painful process of awakening on that balcony that day. And of course, I wasn't aware of this yet, but I was going to come to find out that as I reviewed that experience millions of times in my mind, it began to illuminate to me the kind of answers I was looking for. And so it was really important for me in writing this book to go into great detail about all the different kind of mental programs and functions as they came back online in that kind of reverse awakening I described, because I was essentially given a front row seat into the creation of the ego in my mind and how it finds its genesis. And so one of the first things I saw was that it really does begin with the fundamental belief in separation, which A Course in Miracles talks so much about. And I hadn't even read much of A Course in Miracles up to that point in 2017, but I had read enough of it to have heard the famous quote, "Nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists, herein lies the peace of God." And the other quote I would have been able to give you at that point in my life that the Course teaches was, "The ego is the belief in separation." I knew it as a concept, it made sense conceptually, but I had no real tangible experience of it or inner awareness of it, right? And so I spend the first chapter of the book describing that. From that position of separateness, the ego generates these three beliefs. First in lack, which then creates attachments to external forms. And then those attachments finally create the belief in personal control, personal doership. The part of us that resists life and fights against the present moment, right? So these beliefs are like a chain of interlocking activities that always work together in tandem and feed into one another. And when we put them all together, that's when we get what we call the ego. And in the first chapter of the book, I also spend some time dealing with what I believe are either incorrect or inaccurate kind of definitions of ego, and some that are, I just consider to be not super helpful, such as the ego is your sense of self. You've heard people say that. And in trying to use these definitions for my own awakening at that time in my life, I didn't find them to be all that useful. The ego is my sense of self. Well, I definitely don't want to transcend my sense of self. And then does that mean that my very own sense of self is causing me all this nightmarish torment every day? That's a really dark thought. I didn't even want that to be true. And I found out that it's not true. And I give the sort of easy little twist on that definition that actually makes it true, which is one single word we need to add into that definition. The ego is not your sense of self. The ego is your false sense of self. And that understanding makes all the difference, let me tell you. And so in one of the chapters, I describe it kind of like this. Lack breeds attachment, and attachment breeds control. The reason this is the subject of my first book is because I consider it to be the most important and perhaps the most helpful of all the teachings I have to offer anybody. This framework, more than any other, is what truly freed me from those years of hopeless suffering and depression, which felt completely inescapable at the time. And so this teaching is very sacred to me for that reason, because it in a very real sense, it doesn't really feel like a teaching or something. But even when I connect to the words, it feels more like a sort of a guardian angel that was sent to me from heaven to answer my cries of desperation. It really felt like that, like a light piercing through the clouds for the first time. When I began to understand, hey, look, your ego isn't this complex, powerful enigma you'll never understand or be able to transcend. And I started to see, no, it really is just 3 fundamental core beliefs, and that's it. And without these 3 beliefs, the ego does not exist. That gave me the permission to feel hope again. That gave me the confidence that maybe this isn't so impossible to get back to that heavenly state that I described for those 2 weeks. And so this is where we have to kind of be careful on the spiritual path, I think, because it's very true to say that knowledge is the only savior from ignorance and blindness, because knowledge is truth, right? And only the truth sets us free. So that's why I spend 2 whole chapters on each of the 3 beliefs, describing what they are, kind of their underlying philosophy, and how your emotions signal their influence in your mind. And this signaling helps you to understand how you can requalify them. If you can really understand how these 3 beliefs shape all of human consciousness, all of human thought, how they create this kind of chain of constant self-sabotage in your life, then you can truly begin to transcend them. You don't have to live your entire life feeling incomplete on the inside, feeling like you're not enough, chasing after the wind, needing to control everything in your life. You can be free of these illusions. I'm here to tell you that. Or at least you can minimize their influence to a significant extent. And I want that freedom for every single person on this planet. But back to my awakening experience with Eckhart for a moment. This is where the framework of the book really came in, because I had listened to Eckhart, for countless hours up to that point, teaching about the ego being the voice in the head. And this was really the first aspect of ego that really made sense to me, unlike some of the other definitions I'd heard. It was in large part what also broke me into that kind of astonished, awakened clarity that afternoon on the balcony. But I still felt like I didn't know what to, do with that definition. How do I apply this definition? The ego is the voice in my head. It's like, okay, well, I know that. What do I do about it? How do I get rid of it? Can I get rid of it? Is that the right way to think about it? How do I stop it from constantly controlling me? Are these the thoughts of my ego thinking this too? Like, it almost became a little bit circular as a definition. And so I began asking God for deeper clarity. There's got to be something more to the ego that I'm still missing. What is the ego's foundation that it rests upon? What is the platform from which it's speaking in my mind? There has to be a prior cause to this voice in the head, right? This is what metaphysics and epistemology would show us. This is what logic would show us. So what's interesting about that is that the answers I was looking for, those questions I was asking, didn't actually come from my awakening itself. It didn't come from the 2 weeks I enjoyed in that heavenly state of consciousness. That state was almost a state of not knowing anything, and that's what made it so blissful. The answers in this book actually came from the agonizing process of the reverse awakening, which I describe in the opening chapter. I got to watch this whole process play out in my mind for a number of days in a row because it was a very slow, the ego was knocked unconscious in a very hard way, right? The hammer of awakening hit the ego pretty hard, and it spent a few weeks totally unconscious. And when it came to, it was, whoa, what's all this light and illumination and wisdom? Let's get rid of this and get some ignorance back in here. And it slowly began circumventing that state with its illusions. But it was slow enough and gradual enough that I got to watch it. Every treasure I was holding on to, I got to watch the ego take it out of my hands and replace an illusion with it. And I didn't at the time, I couldn't have really put that to words, but it was all the later years of spiritual study and practice. As I learned more about the ego and I could keep reviewing that experience, I could go back in hindsight, almost like going back in time or something in my mind, and remember each painful day of what new part of the ego resurfaced and what aspects of my freedom slipped through my fingers. And as painful as that is to, review in your mind and re-experience, it was the saving grace. It was what taught me everything. Because I realized after that experience that the ego wasn't just a voice in my head, it was something even deeper than that, something more pervasive than that. And so what I began to see is that the ego is not even really an entity located somewhere in the skull that has a voice, right? Even the idea of the voice in your head can be misleading if you allow it to make you think that there's like an entity speaking that voice in your head, right? If there's a voice, there's an entity speaking the voice, right? That would make sense. And so we picture the ego as an actual like noun, an actual power, an entity with its own mind and will that's like controlling us or something. It's a hard view of the ego to get out of because most of spiritual discussion on it is couched in that kind of language. So we have to take it very metaphorically, right? It's not wrong to talk about the ego like an entity as long as we know that it's really just a metaphorical teaching device. And so I began to realize these things slowly but surely, right? That the ego isn't an entity, but an activity. It's a hardwired belief system that produces thoughts after its own likeness. And so I call it in the book a thought system. And that thought system, like if you said, what is the ego's thought system? I would say 3 words: lack, attachment, control. That's the thought system of the ego. And almost kind of like, waking up from a nightmare or something, when I saw these 3 beliefs at work in my own mind, I easily saw how they are literally running my entire life, my entire mind activity from the shadows, and that these 3 beliefs are creating every problem in my life that I suffer from. And I really tried to investigate that. Can I find a problem, something I suffer from, that doesn't trace back to lack, attachment, or control? And the answer was a clear no. Every single problem was easily traced back to one of these 3 beliefs. And I did it long enough until I thought, okay, point proven. Not going to keep searching anymore. It seems to be the clear case that all the ego's illusions, all of its thoughts, all the suffering it creates are predicated on you first buying in what the ego sells you: lack, attachment, or control. You have to agree with the ego's underlying premise, right? Before it can sell you the thought that looks like that premise. So it's a presupposing, even more so than a belief. Nobody knows that they believe these things, right? Nobody knows if you walk down the street and you interview people in New York or San Francisco or something, and you say, hey, do you believe that you're incomplete? They'll probably not know what you mean. Or if they do know what you mean, if they're a spiritual savant or something, they might say, no, of course not. I know that I'm one with God or whatever. They'd give you some conceptual answer. And maybe you would bump into a truly enlightened person who would give you a genuine answer. But most people would either not know what you mean or say, no, I'm confident in myself. And yet the belief in lack absolutely dominates human consciousness. And here we are thinking that it's not really that big of a problem. It only bothers me when my bank account gets low. It's like, oh baby, are you in for a world of awakening when you see just how pervasive that belief is and how it contaminates every thought you think in some way or another. So once I came to these undeniable conclusions that all of my problems definitely trace back to one of these 3 negative core beliefs, I saw the following conclusion, which the logic can only follow, right? That this is obviously true then for every human being on planet Earth. It can't be a problem that's just unique to me. So while I am aware that only someone who has already begun, their own spiritual awakening would even be interested in reading this book, why would you want to read a book about transcending your ego when you love being an ego? Even though this book is only going to attract those who are on an awakening journey, I still see it and have written it to be a kind of tool in the hands of humanity for anyone who's ready to use these teachings and understandings. Because in the book, what I try to do is outline a simple spiritual practice that teaches the reader how to become conscious of these 3 beliefs in your mind in real time, not just as a concept, but so that you can start seeing them and catching them at work. And when you catch them, that's when you have the power to truly requalify them and pull tremendous amounts of energy out of them. When you can stop yourself from acting from the position of lack or attachment or control and say, wait a minute, there goes sneaky ego, getting me to buy into this underlying lie that I am fundamentally incomplete and therefore need to chase after something. When you can have that level of awareness, you are truly taking the power back over your mind. You are dethroning the ego from its false throne and establishing your own awareness back on that throne where it belongs. And in this practice, what I do is I give two simple tools that teach you how to do this process. One is the emotional guidance system, and the other is the art of requalifying thought. The third chapter of the book is spent explaining what our emotions really are, what the emotional guidance system is, and how emotions are really nothing remotely close to what we've been taught, and how we can then use our emotions, our negative or painful emotions, as the very vehicles to our freedom. Because true spiritual sovereignty has to begin with you ending the war within yourself, right? You've got to come to peace with your own inner world by developing a truly loving relationship toward your emotions. And I teach you how to do that in chapter 3. And then after each of the 3 chapters on the 3 beliefs, there's a following chapter that explains how that specific belief is to be requalified. Because there is only one way, one correct way, to requalify each belief. Each of these beliefs is kind of standing alone in your mind. And so that means that the antithesis of that belief is the truth that unlocks it. So you have to understand the right philosophical view of that belief, lack versus abundance and so forth. And then from that correct understanding of why it's not true that you're lacking, why it can't be true, metaphysically it's impossible that lack could exist. Only once you understand that do you have a strong foundation to requalify the belief in lack from. Now you have a stronger position to stand on than the ego has, and you can speak the truth to the illusion or the belief. And that is what builds a new momentum in your mind, a stronger, deeper belief system that overpowers the previous one, like a natural process of evolution. And so I'll kind of leave it there for now, but before I jump into reading an excerpt from the book and then we take some of your questions, I want to say one more thing about why I wrote this book. Because another aspect of my kind of awakening journey was coming out of fundamentalist Christianity, leaving my religion at 23 and having my whole view of God and life and reality totally upended in a very short period of time. This is what kind of drove me into that dark night of the soul to begin with, followed by divorce and public persecution and all kinds of stuff, loneliness. All these things kind of accumulated at the same time to push me into this desperate state. And after I came out of my awakening, I plunged headlong into the study of NDEs. And then after that, especially Eastern spiritual philosophy. And I spent about 7 years straight reading almost nothing about Jesus or anything related to Christianity at all. And that was very much good therapy for me. I definitely needed that at the time. But because I studied Eastern philosophy so heavily, I began to see that all these traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and all the different flavors and sects within those belief systems really are teaching the same thing. It's just a simple golden thread that weaves its way through all these world religions. I was then able to see that golden thread woven throughout Jesus' gospel teachings quite easily. And that's when the teachings of Jesus really took on a whole new light. Because while Eastern philosophies focus heavily on, knowledge and awareness in these things, kind of the masculine principles, Jesus placed a uniquely strong emphasis on the embodiment and the demonstration of this knowledge through our life, through our actions. And what I've come to find on my own spiritual path is something that is quite shocking to realize, I think, that knowledge alone has no power whatsoever to save you from suffering by itself. You can learn every spiritual concept imaginable and even be able to teach these concepts with great success. And you can, hold public lectures, write books. You can do all the things teaching spiritual knowledge and yet still remain in the same exact bondage to the ego as everybody else. It is only when the truth is put into action that the ego truly begins to lose its power in your mind. When you begin living as if the truth is true, rather than living as if the ego's beliefs are true, that's when the ego is truly drained of power. And having learned this lesson the hard way myself, This is why I focus now so heavily on embodiment as a spiritual teacher. We have to be just as serious with wanting to embody the knowledge we learn, just as quickly as we want to learn it, right? Just as eagerly as we sift through Amazon for the next cutting edge book or sift through the YouTube algorithm for the next cutting edge video that's going to blow my mind with some spiritual concept. All good and well, no problem. But you better be just as excited to integrate that belief into your life, right? Otherwise, it's a dangerous weapon in the hands of the ego. Because despite all of my studying of Eastern philosophy and non-duality, which told me, hey, you're the self, you and God are one, you are pure consciousness, the person is not real, and so forth. None of that knowledge had any power to save me from my suffering. And in many ways, I think it could have made it worse even, because now it appears as if I already know the truth, but the truth can't set me free, right? So bummer, I guess the truth isn't this amazing, powerful thing everyone thinks it is, because I seem to know it, and it seems not to be making a difference. But at the same time, I knew that couldn't be true, because I had been given this 2-week free sample of enlightenment that taught me that freedom really is available for the human being in this life. And all of these realizations, I am the self, God and I are one, I'm pure consciousness, I'm eternal, all of these realizations were effortlessly there, childlike, in that 2-week illumination. And in addition to that, my state of being reflected those truths. I felt truly free and loved and one with God and one with everyone. And despite my most arduous efforts, it would just never happen. I would just always end up in the same mind state as before, and all my failures at realizing oneness would seem to just stir up the ego even more. And so at some point I asked myself, why was freedom so easy and effortless during those 2 weeks and so equally impossible ever since? And as I said a moment ago, a knife in the hands of a mature adult can be a great tool, right? Useful for all kinds of great things. You can cook a meal with it for a whole family. But the same knife in the hands of a small, immature child can become an extremely dangerous weapon. And so that's the shocking truth, right? The spiritual ego will steal and weaponize every single spiritual concept that you learn, but do not integrate. Teachings like non-duality and law of attraction and so forth, I do see these teachings now as a kind of dangerous weapon in the hands of a small child. If someone's not mature enough to handle these teachings yet, they're going to get weaponized by the ego. And in the end, that's okay, right? God's will is always done. All things end in a happy outcome in God's universe. Everyone will learn, everyone will awaken. This is all true. But I'm only interested in minimizing the amount of suffering we have to go through to awaken, right? And A Course in Miracles says that enlightenment is not a learning, but an unlearning. In other words, the heavenly state, it was within me all along. The truth dwells in all of us eternally. But the truth is being covered up. And I've come to see that I don't actually need to realize anything. I don't need to try to realize oneness. Just stop believing in separateness. I don't need to try to realize abundance. I need to stop believing in lack, and so on and so forth. What I need is to unlearn. And unlearn what, you ask? Lack, attachment, and control, the 3 beliefs of the ego. These are the philosophical foundations upon which the ego gains any level of power in your mind when you believe in them. And without these 3 functions, the ego doesn't exist. So it's a lot like trying to see a beautiful view outside your window when there's a thick layer of dirt covering up the glass. You don't need to wreck a hole in your wall and build a new one. You just need to clean the glass off. And then the beauty of nature behind the window stands effortlessly revealed. This is what spiritual awakening is like. And so this book was really written to be the kind of field guide that I wish I had in my spiritual awakening, which would have saved me years of fruitless seeking after knowledge, instead of really focusing on the embodiment and integration of it. And again, this is not to say that seeking didn't teach me a lot of valuable things, but only that I no longer remained in the sinkhole of suffering. Once I understood, I just have to put this knowledge to work now in my life. I have to become a living embodiment of this truth. So what does it mean to embody oneness? I talk about that in the book. Loving relationship. Oneness is loving relationship. Being in loving relationship with all things. That's what oneness really means. And so we have to practice that, right? It's not enough to just know you're one with everything. You have to live as if you are. And that means you have to master the state of giving and receiving. I'm always here to bless and to serve and to help. And I'm always here to accept people as they are without judgment. Like, that's a true loving relationship that demonstrates you truly understand what oneness means. And so for this reason, I think it's very good news that inner freedom doesn't need to take you a lifetime. You just have to know where to look for freedom, right? And begin taking that power back right now, moment by moment. And so in that regard, I'd like to read from page 124, if you have your book. This is from the chapter on the first belief, which is the belief in lack, of course. So let's begin. Top of page 124, if you have your book. All ideas of lack are told in story format. There is always a somebody who needs something, but does not have it, or a story recalled of a past loss. Either this somebody is not receiving the something they need, or they have lost something they need. In either case, the same fact holds true. All lack is a story in the mind. The ego seizes control of our mental energy through the telling of these sad stories. The sadder, the better. All the ego's sad stories have the same underlying narrative. I am lacking. A Course in Miracles says, the way to undo an insane conclusion is to consider the sanity of the premises on which it rests. All the ego's beliefs rest on the insane premise of separation. Without the idea of being a separate self living in a separate universe, a somebody, the ego's belief in lack would be a confusing contradiction of reality. Everything in the universe operates through unity and relationship with everything else. Who could possibly exist apart from such a universe? However, no one is really aware that they believe in lack, as all the ego's beliefs remain safely veiled within the subconscious mind. In other words, lack appears not as a belief system, but as an undeniable, indisputable fact. One that no rational person would dare to question. The ego reasons, I need money to purchase this item that I do not currently have. Therefore, I am lacking money. This seems to be true only until we examine the underlying premise of the idea of lack and discover the faulty conclusion it rests on. Let us begin this examination now. And so from there, I spend the rest of the chapter just kind of slowly eviscerating the philosophy of lack and why it's an absolute contradiction of reality and an impossibility in every way. But until you see that for yourself and really contemplate that that is true, it will always hold power in your mind, right? If you don't know what's true, you really have no choice but to believe in the antithesis of truth. And so really, we're always just allowing a greater level of light or awareness to come through, right? We don't just transcend these beliefs in one foul swoop. Oh, I read the book, got it, moving on, now I'm free. Obviously, it doesn't work like that. The subtitle of the book is A Sufferer's Guide to Freedom, because I'm writing this book to somebody who is in suffering and kind of speaks to you from the ego position and helps talk you out of that position. We're suffering, we're lost, we're confused, etc. How do we get out of this sinkhole? And it begins by realizing what's true. And the truth, as we said, is the only thing that can actually set us free.